Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a story that most of history tried to forget. Because between 1854 and 1929, 250,000 American children were loaded onto trains, shipped across the country like cargo, and handed to strangers who'd never met them before. Some found families who loved them, others found masters who worked them until their bodies broke, and thousands simply vanished into the American frontier, their names erased, their families destroyed, their identities buried under new surnames and new lives they never chose. This is the story of the Orphan Trains, the largest forced child migration in American history. And it started because one city had too many children it didn't want, and one man believed he knew how to make them disappear. You're standing on the corner of Mulberry Street and Bayard in Lower Manhattan. It's 1853, the year before the trains began. And you need to understand what this place looks like before you can understand why anyone thought shipping children west was a solution to anything. The air tastes like coal smoke and human waste. The tenement buildings lean against each other like drunks trying to stay upright. 5 stories tall, brick. Windows so filthy you can't see through them. And inside those buildings, families are crammed into spaces meant for one person. 10 people in a room the size of your closet. Sharing beds, sharing air, sharing diseases that spread faster than anyone can treat them. But you're not inside. You're out here, on the street, where the children are. There are so many children, everywhere you look. Dirty faces, torn clothes, bare feet even though it's February and the cobblestones are slick with ice. They're selling matches, sweeping horse dung off the sidewalks for pennies, begging, stealing, sleeping in doorways and under carts and anywhere they can find shelter from the wind that cuts through the narrow streets like a knife through cloth. 30,000 children. That's how many are living on the streets of New York City right now. Not just orphans, though there are plenty of those. Cholera took their parents, typhoid, yellow fever, the epidemics that roll through the tenements every summer, killing the weak and leaving the survivors to bury bodies and figure out how to feed the children left behind. But most of these kids aren't orphans, not technically. They have parents, somewhere. Parents who can't afford to keep them. Parents who work 16 hours a day in factories and come home too exhausted to care. Parents who drink. Parents who beat them. Parents who looked at their 5 children and decided they could only feed 3, so the other 2 needed to figure out how to survive on their own. So they're here, the street children. The ones the newspapers call street Arabs and gutter snipes and the dangerous classes. The ones who form gangs for protection. The ones who rob you if you're not careful. The ones who sleep 10 to a flophouse bed when they can afford it and freeze to death in alleys when they can't. You watch a boy, maybe 10 years old, darting through the crowd. His hands are quick. He bumps into a well-dressed man, and the man's wallet disappears into the boy's coat before anyone notices. The boy keeps walking, doesn't run. Doesn't draw attention. He's done this 100 times before. He'll do it 100 times more unless someone stops him or teaches him a different way to survive. And nobody is stopping him. Because nobody cares. The police arrest children for vagrancy, throw them in jail for a night, then release them back to the same streets they came from. The churches offer sermons about morality and sin, but they don't offer beds or food or jobs. The almshouses take the children nobody wants, warehouse them with the sick and the insane and the dying, and pretend that's helping. But there's one man who thinks he has a better idea. His name is Charles Loring Brace. He's 27 years old, a Protestant minister, educated, from a respectable family, and he's spent the last year walking these streets, watching these children, and becoming convinced that the city is creating criminals faster than it can punish them. Brace doesn't blame the children. That's what makes him different. He blames the environment, the tenements, the poverty, the lack of opportunity, the corruption of the city that teaches children that stealing is the only way to eat and violence is the only way to survive. And he's decided that the solution isn't reform schools or orphanages or jails. The solution is removal. Take the children out of the city, put them somewhere clean, somewhere moral, somewhere with fresh air and hard work and Christian families who can teach them how to be good Americans instead of criminals. Take them west, to the farms, to the frontier. to families who need extra hands and don't ask too many questions about where the children came from or why they don't have parents. In February of 1853, Charles Loring Brace founds the Children's Aid Society. 9 men join him, wealthy philanthropists who believe that poverty is a solvable problem and children are worth saving. They rent an office, hire staff, start planning a system that will change how America thinks about child welfare. And 18 months later, the first train leaves New York carrying 46 children to a small town in Michigan that most New Yorkers have never heard of. The children don't know where they're going. They don't know who will take them. They don't know if they'll ever see their siblings again, but they're about to find out what it means to be chosen or rejected. On a platform in front of strangers who will decide their futures in minutes, Charles Loring Brace believed he was saving children. That's important to understand, because what he built wasn't designed to be cruel. It was designed to be efficient, to solve a problem that seemed unsolvable, to take children who were dying in the streets and give them a chance at survival. But belief doesn't guarantee outcome, and the system Brace created would save some children while destroying others, would reunite some families while permanently separating thousands more, would become one of the most celebrated social experiments of the 19th century, and one of the most controversial legacies of American child welfare. You need to know who this man was, what he believed, why he thought shipping children across the country was an act of mercy instead of violence. Brace was born in 1826 in Connecticut. His father was a teacher, his mother was educated, he grew up in comfort, went to Yale, studied theology. He was brilliant, idealistic, the kind of young man who believed that faith and reason could solve any problem if applied correctly. He came to New York in the early 1850s as a missionary. His job was to bring religion to the poor, to preach in the tenements, to save souls. But what he found in those tenements horrified him. Not just the poverty, not just the filth, the children, thousands of them, living in conditions that made survival itself a miracle. He started visiting the jails, the reform schools, the institutions where society locked up the children it didn't want. And he became convinced that institutions were part of the problem, that warehousing children in orphanages and almshouses created dependency instead of independence, that what children needed wasn't charity, it was family, work, purpose, the chance to become productive members of society instead of permanent burdens on it. Brace had a theory. He called it environmental determinism, the idea that people weren't born good or bad. They were shaped by their surroundings. Put a child in the corrupt, crowded, immoral city, and that child would become corrupt. But take the same child and place them in the clean, moral, hard-working countryside, and they would become clean and moral and hard-working too. It was a radical idea for its time. Most people believed that poverty was a sign of moral failing, that poor people were poor because they were lazy or sinful or naturally inferior. But Brace believed poverty was circumstantial, that children, especially, were blank slates, that you could save them by changing their environment. And the best environment he could imagine was the American farm, the frontier, the rural communities where families worked the land and went to church and believed in discipline and self-reliance, where labor was scarce and children were valuable, where a boy could learn to plow a field and a girl could learn to keep house, and both could grow up as Americans instead of as the immigrant poor. So Brace devised a plan. He called it placing out. Take children from the streets of New York, clean them up, put them in new clothes, load them on trains, send them to small towns in the Midwest, and let farming families choose which children they wanted to take home. It was adoption, sort of. Except there were no legal protections, no background checks, no requirements for the families who took children, no follow-up visits to make sure the children were safe, no way for children to refuse a placement or leave if they were mistreated, no guarantee that siblings would stay together, or that children would keep their names, or that birth families would ever be able to find them again. But Brace believed the system would work, because he believed in the inherent goodness of rural Americans, because he believed that farming families who chose to take a child would treat that child well, because he believed that hard work and Christian values could cure anything. He wrote about his philosophy in letters and reports, and eventually in a book called The Dangerous Classes of New York, published in 1872. In it, he described the street children as a threat to society, not because they were inherently criminal, but because the city was making them criminal. And if something wasn't done, those children would grow into adults who would tear American society apart. The solution, Brace argued, was emigration. Send the children away. Break the cycle of urban poverty by removing children from it entirely. Give them new lives in places where poverty didn't exist in the same crushing generational way it existed in the tenements of New York, and the Children's Aid Society began implementing that plan immediately. By 1854, they'd identified their first group of children. 46 of them, boys and girls between 7 and 15 years old. Some were true orphans, some had one parent still living, some had been surrendered by families who couldn't keep them. Some had been rounded up off the streets by agents who promised them food and a chance at a better life. They were scrubbed clean, given new clothes, fed a decent meal, told they were going on an adventure, told they would have families and homes and futures. They weren't told that they might never come back, that their siblings might be sent to different towns, that the families who took them might treat them as servants instead of children. In September of 1854, those 46 children boarded a train in New York City, accompanied by an agent from the Children's Aid Society, headed west to Dowagiac, Michigan, a farming community that had been contacted in advance and told to expect children who needed homes. The children didn't know what was waiting for them, didn't understand that they were about to be displayed in front of a crowd, examined like livestock, chosen or rejected based on how strong they looked, or how obedient they seemed, or whether their hair was the right colour. They were just children, scared, hopeful, clutching the hands of siblings they might never see again after that day. And the train rolled west, into history, into legend, into a story that America would celebrate and then forget, and then, a century later, try desperately to understand. But Charles Loring Brace wasn't the only person trying to save New York's children, and his wasn't the only system that would shape the Orphan Train Movement. Because 15 years after Brace founded the Children's Aid Society, a Catholic nun named Sister Mary Irene Fitzgibbon opened a different kind of refuge, one that would send thousands more children west, but with a different philosophy, different methods, different outcomes. You need to understand the tension between these two systems. Because it wasn't just about Catholic versus Protestant. It was about two fundamentally different views of what children needed and what families owed them. Sister Irene was born Catherine Fitzgibbon in Kensington, England in 1823. Her family immigrated to America when she was 9, settled in Brooklyn. She grew up watching the same poverty Brace watched, the same tenements, the same desperate families. But where Brace saw environmental corruption, Sister Irene saw abandoned souls who needed immediate rescue. She entered the Sisters of Charity in 1850, took her vows, became a teacher, and in 1849, during a cholera epidemic that killed thousands in New York, she almost died herself. She survived, barely, and the experience changed her, made her acutely aware of how quickly families could be destroyed, how many children were left orphaned when their parents died. How many mothers, desperate and unmarried and terrified, abandoned newborns because they had no other choice? By 1869, Sister Irene had a vision. She wanted to create a place where mothers could leave babies anonymously. No judgment, no questions, just a safe place where an infant could be surrendered instead of abandoned in an alley or a doorway to freeze or starve. On October 11th, 1869, the New York Foundling Hospital opened in a brownstone on East 12th Street. Sister Irene installed a white wicker cradle at the entrance, a foundling wheel. Mothers could place their babies in the cradle, ring a bell and walk away. The sisters would take the child, feed them, care for them, find them a home. The first night the Foundling Hospital opened, 3 babies were left in the cradle. By the end of the first week, there were 12. By the end of the first year, hundreds. The need was overwhelming, desperate. And Sister Irene realized that her small brownstone wasn't going to be enough. Just like Brace, Sister Irene concluded that the children needed to leave the city, that New York couldn't care for all of them, that the future for these children lay somewhere else. Somewhere with families who wanted them. But Sister Irene's approach was different from Brace's in crucial ways. Where Brace believed in the inherent goodness of Protestant farm families and minimal oversight, Sister Irene insisted on Catholic placement. She believed that children baptized Catholic should be raised Catholic, that their souls were at stake, that placing a Catholic child with a Protestant family was a form of spiritual harm. So she developed a parallel system, one that would send children west on trains just like Brace's system did. But with pre-arranged placements, families were identified in advance, contracts were signed, priests in receiving communities vouched for families, follow-up visits were required. In 1873, the Foundling Hospital sent its first group of children west, not to random towns. To Catholic communities, towns with established parishes, places where the church had a presence and could monitor what happened to the children after they arrived. The children sent by the Foundling Hospital were often younger than those sent by the Children's Aid Society. Babies, toddlers, infants who'd been left in the Foundling wheel and needed homes immediately. They were called the baby trains, and they operated under a different set of assumptions. That these children were too young to have memories of their birth families, that adoption should be permanent and complete, that the best thing for an abandoned infant was a new identity and a fresh start. Sister Irene's system was more careful than Brace's, but it was also more absolute. Children were given new names immediately. Birth records were sealed. The mothers who left babies in the Foundling wheel were never contacted again. There was no possibility of reunion, no way to trace origins. The break was total. And just like Brace's system, Sister Irene's system created saints and tragedies in equal measure. Some families welcomed the children from the Foundling Hospital with open arms, loved them, raised them as their own, gave them educations and inheritances and the full rights of biological children. But others saw the children as free labour, as servants, as obligations they'd accepted for economic reasons and resented every day afterward. Some children were worked until they broke, some were beaten, some were returned to the Foundling Hospital like defective merchandise when they didn't meet expectations. The two systems ran parallel for decades. Brace's Children's Aid Society sending older children to primarily Protestant families across the Midwest. Sister Irene's Foundling Hospital, sending infants and toddlers to Catholic families in pre-arranged placements. Both believed they were doing God's work. Both pointed to success stories as proof their systems worked. Both downplayed or ignored the failures. By the end of the 19th century, the Orphan Train Movement was transporting thousands of children annually. New York was being emptied of its homeless children. The Midwest was filling up with young labourers who worked the fields and helped build the infrastructure of rural America. And the trains kept running, year after year, decade after decade, until the world began to change, until labour laws started protecting children, until state welfare departments started questioning whether shipping children across state lines without oversight was actually legal, until social workers began documenting the abuse and exploitation that happened when children had no protection and families had no accountability. But that ending is still 50 years away. Right now, in the 1850s and 60s and 70s, the system is just beginning. The trains are just starting to roll, and the children are just beginning to understand what it means to be chosen, or to be the one left standing on the platform when everyone else has been taken home. You need to see what that journey looked like, what the children experienced, what the families wanted, what happened in the moments when a child's entire future was decided by strangers who'd known them for 5 minutes. You need to understand what it felt like to be a commodity, to be inspected, to be judged, to know that your survival depended on whether someone thought you looked strong enough or obedient enough or pretty enough to be worth taking home. So we're going to board that first train, September 1854, 46 children, one destination, and a system that will shape American childhood for the next 75 years. You're 12 years old. Your name is Thomas. At least that's what you've been called for the last 12 years. In a few weeks you might have a different name, a family name, one you didn't choose, one that will replace everything you were before this moment. You're standing on a platform at the Grand Central Depot in New York City. It's September of 1854. The morning is cool. The air smells like coal smoke and hot metal. and the sweat of 100 bodies pressed too close together. Your stomach is tight with something that might be excitement or might be terror. You can't tell the difference anymore. There are 45 other children standing with you. You know some of them. Not well. You met them at the Children's Aid Society office 3 days ago when the agents brought you in off the streets, scrubbed you until your skin was raw, cut your hair, gave you clothes that don't fit quite right but are cleaner than anything you've ever worn, fed you bread and soup and told you that you were lucky, that you were getting a chance most street children would never get. A chance at what exactly? Nobody explained. The agent in charge is a man named Mr. Brace, not Charles Loring Brace himself, one of his assistants. A younger man with a serious face and a Bible in his coat pocket. He's been talking to the group all morning, telling you about the journey, about the families waiting in Michigan, about how you need to be on your best behaviour, how you need to show respect, how you need to prove that you're worthy of this opportunity. Worthy. That word keeps coming up. Like you have to earn the right to have a family. Like being a child alone on the streets was your fault and now you have to make up for it by being perfect. You look around at the other children. Most of them are boys. That makes sense. Farmers need boys. Strong backs for ploughing fields and hauling water and working from dawn until dark doing the labour that keeps a farm running. There are a few girls too, younger than the boys mostly, 7 or 8 years old. Old enough to help in the kitchen but young enough to be moulded into whatever the family wants them to be. One girl is holding a rag doll, the only possession she brought with her. Her knuckles are white from gripping it so hard. She hasn't let go since you left the office. You wonder if she understands what's happening, if anyone has explained to her that the family she gets might not let her keep the doll, that everything from her old life might be taken away to make room for the new one. The train is massive. Black iron and steam and wheels taller than you are. You've never been on a train before, none of you have. The closest you've come to leaving New York is walking to the docks to watch the ships come in. But this train is going to take you hundreds of miles away, through states you've never heard of. To a town called Dowagiac in a place called Michigan that might as well be on the moon for how much you know about it. Mr. Brace is calling for everyone to board. The children move as a group. Some are crying, some are silent. One boy, maybe 9 years old, tries to run. He makes it 3 steps before another agent grabs him, hauls him back, tells him firmly that this is for his own good, that the city will kill him if he stays, that the family waiting for him in Michigan is his only chance at survival. The boy stops fighting, goes limp, lets himself be carried onto the train. You watch this happen, and something cold settles in your chest. Because you realise in that moment that you don't have a choice. None of you do. The agents have decided that you're going west. The Children's Aid Society has decided that this is what's best for you. And whether you want this or not doesn't matter. You're going. You climb onto the train. The seats are wooden, hard. The car smells like sawdust and old leather. There are windows, but they're small and grimy. You sit down next to another boy. He's older than you. Maybe 14. He has scars on his hands, the kind you get from working, from factories or docks or fights. He doesn't look at you, just stares straight ahead with the expression of someone who's already given up. Mr. Brace walks down the aisle. He's smiling, trying to make this seem like an adventure, telling the children that they're pioneers, that they're going to help build America, that the families in Michigan are good Christian people who will treat them like their own sons and daughters. But you've been on the streets long enough to recognise a lie. Not a malicious lie. Mr. Brace probably believes what he's saying, but a lie nonetheless. Because you know how the world works. You know that people don't take in street children out of kindness. They take them because they need something. Labour, help, an extra pair of hands to make their lives easier. And you're going to spend the next 2 days on this train wondering what the people in Michigan will see when they look at you. Whether you'll be strong enough, obedient enough, useful enough, whether you'll be chosen at all or left standing on the platform while the other children are taken home. The train lurches forward. Steam hisses from the engine. The wheels begin to turn, and you're moving, away from New York, away from everything you've ever known, toward a future that someone else has chosen for you. You press your face against the window, watch the buildings slide past, the tenements, the crowded streets, The city that almost killed you, but was still the only home you've ever known, and you wonder if you'll ever see it again. The girl with the rag doll starts crying. Soft, hiccuping sobs that she's trying to muffle against the doll's yarn hair. Nobody comforts her. Nobody knows how. You're all alone together. 46 children on a train to nowhere, hoping that wherever you're going is better than where you've been. But hope is a dangerous thing when you don't have any control over what comes next. The train moves through landscapes you've never imagined existed. You've spent your entire life surrounded by brick and stone. Buildings press so close together that sunlight barely reaches the streets. People everywhere. Noise. Chaos. The constant smell of too many humans living in too little space. But outside the train window, there's nothing but open land. Fields that stretch to the horizon. Trees you couldn't name if you tried. Sky so big it makes you feel small and vulnerable and strangely freed all at once. The other children are reacting in different ways. Some press their faces to the windows, stare at the passing scenery with wide eyes, try to memorize details they can describe later if anyone ever asks where they came from or how they got here. Others won't look outside at all. They sit rigid in their seats, eyes closed or fixed on their hands, like they're trying to pretend this isn't happening, that if they don't acknowledge the journey, they won't have to acknowledge the destination. Mr. Brace walks through the car periodically, checks on the children, reminds them to stay seated, to behave, to remember that they're representing the Children's Aid Society and every child who will come after them. The pressure of being first weighs heavy. You can feel it in the way the older boys sit up straighter when Mr. Brace looks at them, in the way the younger children try to stop crying when he comes near. The train stops occasionally. Small stations in towns you don't recognise. People board and exit. They stare at your group, whisper to each other. You can imagine what they're saying. Street children, orphans. City refuse being shipped west because New York doesn't want to deal with them anymore. You're not wrong. That's exactly what people are thinking. Some look at your group with pity, others with suspicion, a few with outright disgust, like you're contagious, like poverty is a disease they might catch if they get too close. At one stop, a woman boards the train. She's well-dressed, middle-aged. She looks at the group of children and her expression softens. She approaches Mr. Brace, speaks to him quietly. You can't hear what she's saying, but you see her gesture toward the younger children. See Mr. Brace shake his head. Explain something. The woman looks disappointed. She leaves a basket of apples on one of the seats before she exits at the next station. The apples are distributed, one per child. You bite into yours and the sweetness explodes in your mouth. It's the best thing you've tasted in months, maybe years. You eat slowly. Make it last. Try to remember this moment because you don't know when you'll taste fresh fruit again. Night falls. The train doesn't stop. The motion becomes rhythmic, hypnotic. Some children sleep, others stay awake. Stare into the darkness outside the windows. You're in the latter group. Your mind won't stop racing. Questions spinning through your head faster than the train wheels turning on the tracks. What if nobody chooses you? What if the family that takes you is cruel? What if you're separated from the few children on this train you've started to recognize as familiar faces? What if this is the worst decision anyone has ever made on your behalf, and you'll spend the rest of your life regretting that you didn't run when you had the chance? But you didn't run, and it's too late now. Morning arrives, the second day of travel. Mr. Brace announces that you'll reach Dowagiac by afternoon. He gathers the children, gives instructions. You need to stand up straight, look people in the eye, answer questions politely, show that you're willing to work. Don't cry, don't complain, don't do anything that would make a family decide you're not worth taking home. The girl with the rag doll raises her hand, asks in a small voice if the families will let her keep her doll. Mr. Brace hesitates, then says that it depends on the family, that she should be prepared to give it up if asked, that her new life will have new things, and she won't need old reminders of where she came from. The girl's face crumples, but she doesn't cry, just holds the doll tighter, and you realize that this is what the system requires. that you surrender everything, your possessions, your memories, your name if necessary, that you become blank slates so families can write whatever story they want on you. The train slows. Buildings appear outside the windows. Small buildings. Nothing like New York. This is Dowagiac. Population maybe 2,000. Farming community, churches, a general store, wide dirt streets, wooden sidewalks. The kind of town where everyone knows everyone and strangers are noticed immediately. And you're about to become the strangest strangers this town has ever seen. 46 children from the city, standing on a platform, waiting to be chosen or rejected based on criteria you don't understand by people you've never met. The train stops. The door opens. Mr. Brace stands, tells the children to follow him, to remember everything he's taught them, to trust that God has a plan. You stand. Your legs are shaky from sitting for 2 days. Your heart is pounding so hard you can feel it in your throat, and you follow the other children off the train and onto the platform where your future is about to be decided. The platform is crowded. You expected that. Mr. Brace told you that the town had been notified in advance, that families interested in taking a child would be here to meet the train. But knowing something intellectually and experiencing it physically are two very different things. There are at least 100 people gathered, maybe more, farmers in work clothes, their wives in simple dresses and bonnets, a few well-dressed men who might be the town's merchants or bankers, the local minister, a doctor, people from all walks of life united by a single purpose. They're here to acquire children. You line up with the others. Mr. Brace arranges you in a row, tallest boys in back, smaller children in front. He's staging you, making sure you're visible, making sure the crowd can see what's available. That word keeps echoing in your head. Available, like your merchandise. Like this is a market and the families are customers and you're the goods being offered for inspection. The crowd moves closer. People walk along the line, look at faces, study builds. One man grabs a boy's arm, squeezes the muscle, nods approvingly. The boy stands frozen, doesn't resist, doesn't react. Just lets himself be examined like livestock at auction. A woman stops in front of the girl with the rag doll, kneels down, asks her name. The girl whispers something you can't hear. The woman smiles. Asks if she'd like to come home and help take care of her own daughter who's just a little older. The girl looks at Mr. Brace. He nods encouragingly. The girl clutches her doll, asks if she can bring it. The woman hesitates, then says yes. The girl's whole body relaxes. She takes the woman's hand. That's the first placement. It happens in less than 2 minutes. More families approach. A farmer selects 2 of the older boys, says he needs help with harvest, promises they'll be treated fairly, fed well, given a place to sleep in the barn until spring when they can move into the house if they work out. The boys go with him. They don't look back. You're still standing in line, waiting, trying to look strong and healthy and willing. A man walks past you, looks you over, moves on. You feel your stomach drop. What did he see that made you unacceptable? Are you too small? Too thin? Is there something wrong with your face or your posture, or the way you're standing? Another man stops. He's older, maybe 50. Weathered face, calloused hands. He asks your age. You tell him 12. He asks if you're strong. You say yes even though you're not sure it's true. He asks if you know anything about farming. You say no, but you're willing to learn. He studies you for a long moment, then nods. Tells Mr. Brace he'll take you. Just like that. Your future is decided. You're going home with this man whose name you don't know, to a farm you've never seen, to do work you've never done, and you have no say in the matter. Mr. Brace approaches, shakes the man's hand, thanks him for giving you this opportunity, explains that there will be a contract. Indenture papers that specify what the man agrees to provide. Food, shelter, clothing, basic education, and what you agree to provide in return. Your labour, your obedience, your commitment to stay until you turn 18 or 21, depending on what the contract says. The man introduces himself. His name is Mr. Hadley. He has a farm 3 miles outside town. Grows wheat and corn. Keeps chickens and pigs. His wife died 2 years ago. His own sons are grown and moved to their own homesteads. He needs help. You'll work hard, he tells you. But you'll eat regular meals and sleep in a real bed and learn skills that will serve you the rest of your life. You nod. Try to look grateful. This is supposed to be your lucky day. You've been chosen. You're one of the fortunate ones. But all you feel is numb. Mr. Hadley tells you to say goodbye to the other children. You look down the line. Most of the older ones are already paired with families. The younger children are taking longer. Families want time to assess temperament, to make sure they're getting a child who won't be too much trouble, who can be shaped into what they need. The boy you sat next to on the train is still waiting, the one with scars on his hands. He's watching the families pass him by with an expression of growing resignation. You catch his eye, want to say something. But what is there to say? Good luck. I hope you find a good family. I hope we both survive this. Before you can speak, Mr. Hadley puts a hand on your shoulder. Time to go. You follow him away from the platform, away from the other children. Away from the only people in this entire town who have any idea what you're feeling right now. Mr. Hadley has a wagon waiting. You climb into the back, sit on rough wooden boards. The wagon starts moving. You watch the town recede, watch the train platform disappear. On that platform there are still children standing, waiting, hoping, the ones who haven't been chosen yet. You'll learn later that all but 3 were placed that day. The 3 who weren't, 2 boys with obvious physical disabilities and 1 girl who wouldn't stop crying, were sent back to New York on the next train. Returned like defective merchandise. Their chance at a new life revoked because they didn't meet the standards the families required. But right now you don't know that. Right now you're watching the landscape change. Town giving way to open farmland. Watching the sun start to set over fields that stretch forever. And you're wondering what happens next. Whether Mr. Hadley is as decent as he seems. Whether you'll be treated like a member of the family or a servant. Whether this gamble that Charles Loring Brace made with your life will pay off or destroy you. The wagon hits a rut. You bounce. Grab the side to steady yourself. And ahead of you, in the distance, you see a small farmhouse, weathered wood, smoking chimney, a barn, a chicken coop, fields that need harvesting before winter comes. This is your new home, whether you want it or not, whether it's good for you or not, whether you survive here or break here. This is what the orphan trains were built to do. Take children from one life and drop them into another, hope for the best. And move on to the next train load before anyone could measure the damage or the triumph. The farmhouse looks smaller up close. 1 story, maybe 3 rooms total. The wood is weathered grey. The roof sags slightly in the middle. There's a vegetable garden beside the house, mostly harvested already, with a few withered tomato plants clinging to stakes. The barn is larger than the house. That tells you something about Mr. Hadley's priorities. He pulls the wagon to a stop, climbs down. You follow, your legs stiff from the ride. The ground feels different here. Not cobblestone or packed dirt worn smooth by thousands of feet. This is real earth. Soft. Still holding the warmth of the afternoon sun. You can smell it. Soil and hay and something else. Animal musk, chickens probably, maybe pigs. Mr. Hadley gestures toward the house. Tells you to follow him. The door isn't locked. Nobody locks doors out here, he explains. No need. Nearest neighbour is half a mile away and everyone knows everyone, and theft isn't something people worry about when there's nothing worth stealing. Inside, the house is sparse. A main room with a table and 4 chairs, a wood stove, shelves holding dishes and supplies, 2 doors leading to what you assume are bedrooms. Everything is clean but worn. The kind of clean that comes from necessity, not abundance. Nothing decorative, no curtains, no rugs, just the bare minimum needed for survival. This is wealth by your standards. You grew up sleeping in doorways, eating out of trash bins, fighting rats for scraps. A room with a roof and a stove and a table feels like luxury, but you can see that by Mr. Hadley's standards this is modest. Possibly poor, the kind of farm that requires constant labour just to break even. That's why you're here. Not because Mr. Hadley wanted a child to love, because he needed a worker he didn't have to pay. He shows you where you'll sleep, a small room off the main area. It used to be a pantry, judging by the shelves lining one wall. There's a narrow bed, a thin blanket, a wooden crate that serves as a table, one small window. The room is barely bigger than a closet, but it's yours, private, more space than you've ever had in your entire life. Mr. Hadley tells you that supper will be in an hour, that he expects you to wash before meals, that there's a pump outside and a basin on the porch, that cleanliness is next to godliness, and he won't have anyone at his table who doesn't respect that. You nod, ask where the outhouse is. He points. Beyond the barn. You'll figure it out. He leaves you alone. You sit on the bed. The mattress is stuffed with straw. It crinkles when you move, but it's softer than ground, softer than the wooden train seat you spent 2 days on. You lie back, stare at the ceiling. Try to process everything that's happened in the last 72 hours. 3 days ago, you were on the streets of New York, sleeping wherever you could, stealing food, wondering if you'd survive the winter. Then the agents from the Children's Aid Society found you, offered you a chance at something better. You didn't really believe them, but you were hungry enough and desperate enough to take the risk. Now you're here, in Michigan, on a farm, with a man who seems decent enough but who clearly expects something in return for the bed and the meals he's providing. The contract Mr. Brace made Mr. Hadley sign specified that you'd work until you turned 18. That's 6 years. 6 years of labour in exchange for room and board, and the promise of basic schooling during winter months when the farm work slows down. You don't know if that's a fair trade, you have nothing to compare it to. No other options. No way to go back even if you wanted to. The train that brought you here is already gone. Already returning to New York to pick up another load of children for another town somewhere west. Outside your window you can see the fields. Row after row of corn, most of it already harvested. The stalks that remain are brown and dry. Beyond the corn there's wheat stubble. Beyond that, the landscape feels endless, empty. So different from the crowded, chaotic streets you grew up on that it might as well be a different planet. You hear Mr. Hadley moving round in the main room, smell something cooking, potatoes maybe. Your stomach clenches with hunger. You haven't eaten since the apple on the train yesterday. You stand, find the pump outside, work the handle until water comes out. It's cold, so cold it makes your hands ache. You splash your face, your neck, try to scrub away 2 days of travel grime. When you come inside, Mr. Hadley is setting the table, 2 plates, 2 cups, a pot of boiled potatoes and salt pork, bread that's dense and dark. He gestures for you to sit. You do? He bows his head, says Grace. Thanks God for the food and the harvest and the help that's been provided in the form of you. You're supposed to feel grateful. This is the narrative Charles Loring Brace created, that you've been rescued from certain death in the city and given a chance at an honest life, that you should be thankful for this opportunity. And maybe you are grateful. It's hard to tell through the exhaustion and fear and uncertainty. You eat the potatoes. They're bland but filling. The salt pork is tough and greasy. The bread sticks in your throat, but it's food. Real food. More than you've had in weeks. Mr. Hadley watches you eat. Tells you that tomorrow you'll start learning the work. That harvest is almost finished, but there's plenty to do before winter. Wood to chop, fences to repair, animals to tend. He'll teach you everything. But he expects you to pay attention and work hard and not complain. You nod. Promise you won't complain. Promise you'll work hard. Promise whatever he needs to hear. Because you understand the reality of your situation. You're not his son. You're his employee. And if you don't perform, if you don't meet his expectations, you could be sent back. Returned like the children on the platform who weren't good enough. And then what? Back to the streets, to another family, to nowhere. After supper, Mr. Hadley tells you to get some sleep. Morning comes early on a farm. 4:30 or 5. There are chickens to feed and eggs to collect and a dozen other tasks before breakfast. You'll learn the routine fast. You don't have a choice. You go to your small room, close the door, lie on the straw mattress and listen to the silence. It's so quiet here. No street noise, no voices, no constant sound of humanity pressed together. Just wind, crickets. The occasional sound of an animal moving in the barn. You're 12 years old. You're alone. And your new life has begun whether you're ready for it or not. The rooster wakes you before dawn. You've never heard a rooster before. The sound is jarring, aggressive, nothing like the ambient noise of the city that used to pull you from sleep. You stumble out of bed. Your body aches from the train ride and the unfamiliar mattress and the tension you've been carrying for days. Mr. Hadley's already up, already dressed. He hands you a bucket, tells you to follow him to the chicken coop. The air outside is cold. Your breath comes out in clouds. The sky's just starting to lighten in the east. Everything is grey and shadowy and unfamiliar. The chickens are loud, aggressive. They peck at your hands when you reach for the eggs. Mr. Hadley laughs, says you'll get used to it, that chickens are stupid and mean but useful, that everything on a farm has a purpose and nothing exists just to be pretty. You collect 12 eggs, carry them carefully back to the house. Mr. Hadley shows you how to check for cracks, how to store them. Then he hands you an axe, tells you to split firewood, points to a pile of logs beside the barn and a chopping block worn smooth from years of use. You've never used an axe before. The weight of it feels wrong in your hands. Too heavy. Too dangerous, Mr. Hadley demonstrates. Positions a log on the block, brings the axe down in a clean arc that splits the wood perfectly, makes it look easy. Then he hands the axe back to you, tells you to try. Your first swing misses the log entirely. The axe buries itself in the chopping block. Mr. Hadley sighs, extracts the axe, positions your hands correctly, explains about momentum and aim and letting the weight of the axe do the work. You try again. This time you hit the log but don't split it. The axe gets stuck. You have to wiggle it free. Try again, and again, and again. By the time you manage to split your first log, your shoulders are screaming. Your hands are blistered. Sweat is running down your back despite the cold air. Mr. Hadley nods approvingly, tells you to split 20 more, then come in for breakfast. 20 logs. Each one requires multiple attempts. Your hands start bleeding. You don't complain, don't ask for a break. You remember what Mr. Hadley said last night, that he expects hard work and no complaints, that your value here is measured entirely by your ability to contribute labour. When you finally finish, the sun is fully up. You stumble back to the house. Your hands are shaking. Mr. Hadley glances at them, tells you to wash and bandage them before breakfast, that you'll develop calluses eventually and the pain will stop, that every farm boy goes through this, that it's part of becoming useful. Breakfast is porridge and eggs. You eat mechanically, your hands hurt too much to feel hungry. But you force the food down because you don't know when the next meal will be, and your body needs fuel for whatever comes next. After breakfast, Mr. Hadley takes you to the fields, shows you how to clear the remaining corn stalks, how to bundle them for animal feed, how to check for any missed ears. The work is repetitive, back-breaking. You bend and cut and bundle for hours. The sun climbs higher, your back starts to spasm, your legs tremble. This is nothing like the life you imagined. When Mr. Brace talked about farms, he made them sound pastoral, peaceful. He talked about fresh air and honest work and families. He didn't mention the physical pain, the exhaustion so deep it makes your bones ache, the loneliness of working in a field with only one other person and nothing to break the monotony except the sound of your own breathing. Mr. Hadley doesn't talk much while you work. Occasionally he corrects your technique, points out areas you missed, but mostly he's silent, focused on his own labour. You're working side by side, but there's no camaraderie, no sense that you're building a relationship. You're just two bodies performing necessary tasks. Lunch is bread and cheese eaten in the field, no break, no rest, just food consumed quickly so you can get back to work. Mr. Brett. Hadley explains that harvest season is the most critical time of year, that every hour of good weather needs to be used, that winter comes fast and unforgiving, and if the work isn't finished before the first snow, the farm suffers. You're part of that calculation now. Your labour is factoring into whether this farm survives the winter, whether Mr. Hadley can pay his debts and buy supplies and make it through to spring planting. You're not a child here. You're an economic unit, a tool, one that needs to justify the cost of feeding and housing it. The afternoon stretches endlessly. Your mind goes numb. Your body moves on autopilot. Bend, cut, bundle, bend, cut, bundle. The repetition becomes hypnotic. You stop thinking about New York. Stop thinking about the other children on the train. Stop thinking about anything except the next stalk. The next bundle, the next moment of endurance. When Mr. Hadley finally calls an end to the workday, the sun is setting. You've been working for nearly 12 hours. Your hands are bleeding through the bandages. Your back won't straighten. Your legs barely support your weight. Mr. Hadley looks you over, nods, says you did decent work for your first day, that you'll get stronger. That farm work either breaks you or makes you, and he's betting you're the type who gets made. You're not sure if that's a compliment or a threat. Supper is more potatoes and salt pork. You eat in silence. Wash your dish. Go to your small room. Collapse on the straw mattress. Every muscle in your body is screaming. Your hands throb. You're pretty sure you're going to die during the night from exhaustion or pain or both. But you don't die. You sleep. Deep and dreamless. And when the rooster crows the next morning, your body protests but obeys when you force yourself out of bed. Because this is your life now. This is what being saved looks like. This is the opportunity Charles Loring Brace believed was better than the streets of New York. And maybe it is better. Maybe survival with purpose is preferable to survival through theft and luck. Maybe regular meals and a bed are worth the physical destruction. Maybe you'll look back on this someday and be grateful. But right now, on your second morning on this farm, all you feel is pain, and the crushing realization that you have 6 more years of this ahead of you. You won't learn what happened to the other children for months, won't hear their stories until winter, when the farm work slows and Mr. Hadley takes you into town for supplies, and you see a few familiar faces from the train. By then, the experiences have diverged so dramatically that you might as well have been sent to different countries instead of different farms in the same county. The girl with the rag doll found something close to what Charles Loring Brace promised. The family who took her had wealth. Not extravagant wealth, but comfort. A house with multiple bedrooms, a mother who wanted a daughter to raise. They treated her gently, let her keep the doll, enrolled her in school, gave her a new name, Emma, after the mother's deceased sister, and folded her into their family as if she'd always belonged. She's one of the lucky ones, one of the success stories the Children's Aid Society will point to decades later as proof that the system worked. That removing children from the city and placing them with rural families saved lives and created productive citizens. But Emma is the exception, not the rule. 2 of the boys placed that day in Dowagiac are working farms just like you. One has it easier, a younger couple with small children who treat him more like a big brother than a servant. The other has it worse. His family is poorer than Mr. Hadley, desperate enough that they took a child for the labour but can't really afford to feed him. He's losing weight, sleeping in the barn, working longer hours than you are. When you see him in town that first winter, his eyes are hollow. He doesn't talk about his placement, doesn't need to. You can see it written in his body. The boy with scars on his hands, the one who sat beside you on the train, was placed last. Taken by a family that wanted field labour but nothing else. No pretense of adoption, no offer of education or family inclusion, just work. He ran away after 3 months, made it 50 miles before he was caught and returned, ran again, was caught again. The 3rd time, the family gave up, sent him back to the Children's Aid Society as defective, too difficult, too damaged from his city life to be reformed. You'll never find out what happened to him after that. He disappears into the cracks of the system, one of thousands of children who were placed and returned and placed again until they aged out or died or simply vanished into the enormous, indifferent landscape of 19th century America. There are success stories beyond Emma. A boy placed with a wealthy family in Illinois who eventually inherits the farm. Sends his own children to college, lives to see his grandchildren, dies at 73 with his name on a tombstone and people who mourn him. He's everything the Orphan Train Movement wanted to create. There's a girl placed in Iowa who becomes a teacher, marries, has a family, never speaks about her origins. When her children ask where she came from, she says her parents died when she was young, and a kind family took her in. It's not technically a lie, but it's not the whole truth. She doesn't mention the train, the platform, the selection process that reduced her to a commodity. She buries that part of her past so deep that her descendants won't discover it until they start researching genealogy a century later and find the records that prove their grandmother was an orphan train rider. That's common. The silence. The shame. Even the ones who found good placements often don't talk about it, because being chosen meant someone decided you were worth taking. But being chosen also meant you were in a position to need choosing in the first place, that you were poor, unwanted, abandoned, that your existence began with rejection. The system created approximately 200,000 of these stories between 1854 and 1929. 200,000 children placed, 200,000 different outcomes, and the range between the best and worst is staggering. Best case, you're adopted by a loving family, given education, inheritance, a real place in the family structure. You marry well. Your children never know you came from the streets. Your life becomes indistinguishable from someone born into rural prosperity. Worst case, you're worked until your body breaks, beaten, sexually abused, treated as property. You run away and die of exposure, or you stay and die of neglect, or you survive but carry trauma so deep that you can't form healthy relationships, can't trust, can't escape the poverty you were supposedly rescued from. Most cases fall somewhere in the middle, like yours. You work hard, you're fed adequately, you're not abused but you're not loved either. You exist in a grey space where your labour is valuable, but your personhood is irrelevant. You learn skills, you survive, but you never stop feeling like an outsider, like someone who doesn't really belong anywhere. The Children's Aid Society keeps minimal records of outcomes. They don't follow up consistently, don't track which children thrive and which suffer. They operate on the assumption that any placement is better than the alternative, that the streets of New York are so terrible that even exploitation on a farm is an improvement. Sometimes that's true. You think about the winters you spent in the city, the times you almost froze to death, the constant hunger, the violence, the sense that death was always one bad decision away. Compared to that, farm work is survivable, predictable. You know where your next meal is coming from. You have shelter. You're not going to die of exposure or starvation, but you've also lost everything. Your city, your identity, your freedom to choose your own path. You're bound to Mr. Hadley until you turn 18, 6 years. And even after you're free, where will you go? What will you do? You'll have farming skills but no money, no family, no connections. You'll be adrift in exactly the same way you were adrift on the streets of New York, just in a different landscape. The Orphan Train Movement created 2 million descendants, people alive today whose grandparents or great-grandparents rode those trains. Many of them are searching for answers, trying to trace family trees that were deliberately severed, looking for birth names that were changed, seeking siblings who were separated and never reunited. The genealogical impact of the orphan trains is still unfolding. DNA tests are connecting people who had no idea they were related. Records are being unsealed. Stories are being recovered from archives and attics and fading memories. But for you, in 1854, on a farm in Michigan, the future is unknowable. You're 12 years old. Your hands are calloused. Your back aches constantly. You're learning to split wood and harvest corn and survive in a world that's nothing like the one you came from. And every night, before you fall asleep, you wonder if the other children from the train are thinking about you, if they remember your face, if any of you will ever see each other again, or if you've all become ghosts to each other, scattered across the Midwest, connected only by the shared memory of a train ride that changed everything, and the haunting question of whether being saved was worth the cost of everything you lost. You've been on Mr. Hadley's farm for 6 months when you hear about the second train. Winter has arrived. The fields are frozen. The work has shifted from harvest to maintenance, chopping wood, repairing tools, tending animals in weather that makes your fingers go numb even inside gloves. Mr. Hadley takes you to town for supplies, and that's where you hear the news. Another train is coming. 50 children this time. More than the first group. The Children's Aid Society is expanding. What started as an experiment has become a system, a solution to New York's ongoing crisis of homeless children, and small towns across Michigan and Illinois and Iowa are lining up to receive them. You stand in the general store listening to the farmers discuss it. How many boys versus girls? What ages? Whether the children will be as good as the first batch. They're talking about human beings like they're discussing seed quality or livestock breeds. You feel something twist in your chest. Anger, maybe, or recognition. Because you know exactly what those 50 children are experiencing right now. The train ride, the fear, the uncertainty. The storekeeper mentions that the local minister has concerns that some families took children from the first train and aren't treating them properly, that there should be oversight, follow-up visits, legal protections. One of the farmers laughs, says the whole point of the system is that it's cheap and efficient, that if you start adding bureaucracy and regulations, you'll ruin it, that children need work and discipline, not coddling, that the city kids who can't handle farm life probably wouldn't have survived the streets anyway. You stay silent. You've learned that lesson in 6 months. Keep your head down. Don't voice opinions. You're not part of the conversation about your own life. You're the subject of it. The commodity being discussed. Mr. Hadley buys his supplies. You load them into the wagon. On the ride home, he tells you that he's considering taking another child. A younger one, 8 or 9. Someone you could train. Someone who could help with the lighter work while you handle the heavy labour. You're 12 years old and he's talking about you as if you're an adult labourer who needs an assistant. As if 6 months of farm work has erased your childhood completely. Made you into something else. Something useful. But you also understand the calculation. If Mr. Hadley takes another child, that means the work is being distributed. That you won't carry the entire burden alone. So you tell him you think it's a good idea. That you'd be willing to help train a younger child. That you remember how hard the first days were and you could make it easier for someone else. Mr. Hadley seems pleased. He's not sentimental about it. He's not talking about giving a child a home or providing love or building a family. He's talking about labour allocation, efficiency, making the farm more productive. But if that results in another child being fed and housed and surviving, maybe that's enough. Maybe that's the best the system can offer. The second train arrives in Dowagiac 2 weeks later. You don't go to the selection. Mr. Hadley goes alone. Returns with a boy named James, 8 years old, thin as a rail, eyes too big for his face. He looks at you with a mixture of hope and terror. You recognise that look. You wore it 6 months ago. James becomes your responsibility. Mr. Hadley assigns him to you. You're supposed to teach him the morning chores, how to collect eggs without getting pecked, how to feed the chickens, how to carry water, the easy tasks, the ones that don't require strength you build only through months of hard labour. At first, James doesn't talk. He follows you silently, mimics your movements, flinches when you move too quickly. You realise he's been hit. Probably a lot. Probably his whole life. He's expecting violence because that's all he's known. You make yourself slow down, gentle your voice. Show him that not every adult is a threat. That this place, for all its hardships, isn't the same as whatever he escaped in New York. You don't know his story. He doesn't volunteer it. But you see it in his body, the way he protects his ribs, the way he eats too fast, like someone might take the food away, the way he hoards the small piece of bread you give him at lunch, hiding it in his pocket for later. You were never that bad. You were street poor, but you weren't beaten poor. There's a difference. James has experienced something you didn't, and now he's here. 8 years old. Expected to work until he's 18 or 21. 10 years minimum. More than half his life so far. An eternity when you're 8. You teach him the chicken routine. He's gentle with them. Better than you were at first. He has small hands, quick movements. The chickens tolerate him. By the end of the first week, he's collecting eggs without getting pecked. That's progress. That's survival. At night, you can hear him crying in the small room Mr. Hadley cleared out for him. Soft, muffled sounds. He's trying not to be heard. Trying not to be a problem. You remember that feeling. The desperate need to prove you're worth keeping. That you're not too much trouble. That you deserve the bed and the food and the chance you've been given. You want to comfort him. But you don't know how. You're 12. You're barely surviving yourself. So you lie in your own bed and listen to James cry and feel helpless. Feel angry at a system that does this to children. That rips them from one trauma and drops them into another and calls it rescue. The second train brings 50 children to Michigan. They scatter to farms across 3 counties. Some will thrive, some will suffer, some will die before they reach adulthood, and the Children's Aid Society will send another train in 3 months, and another after that, and another. By 1855, just 1 year after the first train, the system is processing hundreds of children annually. The demand from farming communities is insatiable. The supply of homeless children in New York seems endless, and the trains keep running, week after week, month after month, year after year. You're witnessing the birth of something massive, a social engineering project that will reshape American childhood, that will move 250,000 children across the country, that will create 2 million descendants, that will become one of the most significant and controversial child welfare experiments in history. But right now, you're just trying to teach an 8-year-old how to survive his first winter on a Michigan farm, how to split kindling without cutting himself, how to walk through snowdrifts to reach the barn, how to endure cold so brutal it makes your lungs hurt just breathing, and you're hoping that James is stronger than he looks, that he'll make it, that in 6 months he'll be the one teaching the next child who arrives, that the cycle will continue and somehow, despite everything, these children will survive what's being done to them in the name of charity. You don't understand the religious politics at first. You just know that in 1869, 15 years after your arrival, something changes in the system. A new organization starts sending children west, the New York Foundling Hospital, run by Catholic nuns, and suddenly the placement process becomes more complicated. You're not on a farm anymore by then. You're 27. You served your indenture. You stayed with Mr. Hadley until you turned 18, then worked for wages for 2 more years while you saved enough to lease your own land. You're not successful exactly, but you're surviving. You've built the life Charles Loring Brace promised. You're a farmer, a landowner technically, even if you're drowning in debt. You're an American. But you pay attention to the orphan trains because they're still running, still bringing children west, still reshaping communities, and now there are 2 systems operating simultaneously, sometimes competing, sometimes cooperating, always uneasy with each other. The difference between the Children's Aid Society and the Foundling Hospital isn't just religious, it's philosophical. Brace believed in speed and volume. Get children out of the city fast. Place them with any family willing to take them. Trust that rural Christian values would do the rest. Minimal oversight, minimal bureaucracy, maximum efficiency. Sister Mary Irene Fitzgibbon, who runs the Foundling Hospital, believes in control, in pre-arranged placements, in matching Catholic children with Catholic families, in follow-up visits from priests, in maintaining some connection to the church, even as children scatter across the frontier. The competition between the 2 organizations is bitter. Brace accuses the Catholic Church of prioritizing religion over children's welfare, of refusing to place Catholic children with Protestant families even when those families are wealthier and more stable, of letting children suffer in orphanages rather than allowing them to be adopted by the wrong denomination. Sister Irene accuses the Children's Aid Society of cultural genocide, of deliberately placing Irish and Italian Catholic children with Protestant families to convert them, of using child welfare as a tool of assimilation, of failing to protect children from abuse because follow-up is expensive and inconvenient. They're both right. They're both wrong. The truth is messier than either organisation wants to admit. You see this firsthand when a Foundling Hospital train arrives in a nearby town. You're there on business, selling wheat. You watch the children disembark. They're younger than the Children's Aid Society children usually are. Babies, toddlers. The Foundling Hospital specialises in foundlings, abandoned infants left in the white wicker cradle at the hospital entrance, babies whose mothers couldn't keep them, who were surrendered anonymously with no names, no histories, no connections to their past. These children are being given entirely new identities, new names, new birth dates, new origins. The families taking them have been vetted in advance, approved by local priests, They're not standing on platforms selecting children. They've already committed. They're just here to pick up the specific child they've been assigned. It seems more humane than the Children's Aid Society method. No public selection, no rejection. Every child is wanted before they even arrive. But you see the flip side too. These children will never know where they came from. Their birth mothers will never be able to find them. The severance is absolute, total, permanent. A woman picks up a 2-year-old girl. The child is crying. Reaching for the nun who accompanied the train, the woman is patient, kind. She rocks the child, speaks softly. Eventually the crying stops. The child accepts the new arms holding her, and just like that she belongs to someone else, has a new mother, a new family, a new life. You wonder if that's better or worse than your experience. You were old enough to remember New York, to remember your life before the train, to carry that history with you. These foundling children won't have that. They'll grow up believing they were born into the families that took them, never knowing about the mother who left them in a cradle, the city they came from, the journey that brought them here. The Catholic-Protestant tension plays out in strange ways. Towns with Catholic majorities prefer foundling hospital children. Towns with Protestant majorities prefer Children's Aid Society children. Some towns refuse one organisation's children entirely. And children themselves become pawns in a religious conflict that has nothing to do with their welfare and everything to do with which denomination controls the narrative of American childhood. You hear stories. A Catholic couple in Iowa takes a Children's Aid Society child. The local priest refuses to baptize the child Catholic, says the placement was illegitimate. The couple has to choose between their faith and the child. They choose their faith. The child is returned, sent to another family, another town, another attempt at placement. A Protestant couple takes a foundling hospital child. The local priest demands visitation rights to ensure the child is being raised Catholic. The couple refuses, says they'll raise the child in their own faith. The foundling hospital threatens to remove the child. The standoff lasts months. Eventually the couple gives in. The child attends Catholic services. The family attends Protestant services. The child grows up confused about what they're supposed to believe. These religious battles are fought over children's bodies and souls, but the children themselves have no say, no choice, no ability to opt out of the conflict. They're just trying to survive, trying to find a place where they belong, trying to build identities when everyone around them is fighting about who gets to define what those identities should be. By 1875, both organisations are operating at full capacity. The Children's Aid Society has placed over 40,000 children. The Foundling Hospital has placed thousands more. The numbers keep growing, the trains keep running. And the American Midwest is filling up with children who came from somewhere else, who carry secrets in their bones, who will pass those secrets down to descendants who won't understand why family trees are impossible to trace, and genealogy hits dead ends and DNA tests reveal surprises nobody expected. You're part of that legacy, one of the first, one of the 46 children on the inaugural train. You survived. You built a life. You're supposed to be a success story. Proof that the system works. Evidence that Charles Loring Brace's vision was correct. That removing children from cities and placing them in rural families saves lives. But late at night, when you're alone, you think about the cost. About James, who's now 21 and working a neighbouring farm and won't talk about his childhood. About the boy with scars who ran away and disappeared. About the thousands of children who didn't survive their placements, who died from accidents or abuse or neglect, or the crushing weight of expectations they couldn't meet. You think about the children on the newest trains, the babies being given to strangers, the older kids being displayed on platforms, and you wonder how long the system will continue. How many more children will be processed before someone asks whether this is actually mercy or just a more organised form of abandonment? The answer is 54 more years. The trains will run until 1929, until labour laws make child workers less valuable, until state welfare systems develop alternatives, until the economic and social forces that made the trains possible finally shift enough that the system becomes obsolete. But that's decades away. Right now, in the 1870s, the orphan trains are still expanding, still celebrated, still considered one of America's great social innovations, and you're living proof that children can survive anything, even salvation. Not every child stayed where they were placed. That's the part of the story the Children's Aid Society and the Foundling Hospital don't like to discuss. The returns, the failures, the children who didn't work out. You're 35 when you first see a return happen in your own community. A boy placed 2 years earlier. 13 now. He's being escorted back to the train station by the farmer who took him. The boy is silent. His face is blank. The farmer is angry, complaining to anyone who will listen about ungrateful city children who don't appreciate the opportunities they're given. The story comes out in pieces. The boy ran away 3 times, refused to work, stole food and money, was caught trying to hop a freight train back to New York. The farmer says he gave the boy every chance, that he was patient and fair, that some children are just rotten, born bad, impossible to fix no matter how good the environment. You look at the boy and see yourself at 13, see the anger and fear and desperation, and you wonder what really happened in that house, what the farmer isn't saying, what the boy can't say because nobody's asking him for his version of the story. The boy is sent back to New York, returned like defective merchandise. He'll be processed through the Children's Aid Society again, maybe placed with another family, maybe sent to a reformatory, maybe just released back to the streets he came from. Nobody tracks what happens to returned children. They disappear from the records, become footnotes, failures in a system that measures success by placement numbers, not outcomes. Returns happen more often than the organizations admit. Conservative estimates suggest that 15 to 20% of placements fail. Children are returned for being too difficult, too damaged, too old to be properly trained, too sickly, too defiant. Sometimes families return children because their economic situation changes and they can't afford to feed extra mouths. Sometimes they return children because the child reminds them of someone they lost and the grief is too much. Sometimes they return children because they wanted a specific type. A docile girl, a strong boy, and the child they got didn't match expectations. The children who are returned carry that rejection for the rest of their lives. They were already abandoned once, by birth parents or circumstances or poverty. Being placed and then returned is a second abandonment, a confirmation that something about them is fundamentally unwanted, unlovable, broken. You know a woman, placed as a girl in 1861, who was returned twice before finding a permanent family. She doesn't talk about the first 2 placements, won't say what happened, but she has scars, cigarette burns on her arms, a crooked finger that was broken and never set properly. She married young, had 6 children. Holds them so tightly that her oldest daughter once said she felt suffocated by her mother's love. That kind of grip comes from losing things, from knowing that anything you love can be taken away without warning. Then there are the children who return themselves, who run away from placements and make their way back to New York through sheer determination, walking, hopping trains, begging rides. It sometimes takes months, sometimes years, but they go back to the city that Charles Loring Brace insisted was killing them, back to the streets, back to poverty and danger and all the things the orphan trains were supposed to save them from. Why would a child choose that? Why would anyone voluntarily return to destitution? Because sometimes the known hell is preferable to the unknown one. Because sometimes the streets are safer than the farms. Because sometimes the family you find in the city, the other street children, the informal networks of survival, is more real than the family that takes you for your labour. You meet one of the runaways in 1883, a young man, maybe 20. He tells you he was placed in Iowa at age 10, worked on a farm for 3 years, then ran away, walked and hitchhiked back to New York, spent another 4 years on the streets, eventually got arrested, spent time in a reformatory. Now he's back out west working as a labourer, trying to build a life on his own terms. You ask him why he ran. He looks at you like the answer should be obvious. Because I was a slave, he says. They called it indenture, called it opportunity, but I was a slave. No wages, no freedom, no choice. And the man who owned me, he trails off, doesn't finish the sentence, doesn't need to. You can imagine what happened, can fill in the blanks with the stories you've heard over 3 decades of watching the orphan train system operate. The return rate would be higher if children had the option, but most don't. They're hundreds of miles from New York with no money and no way to get back. They're bound by legal contracts their guardians signed. They're children in a world that doesn't give children much agency or protection. So they stay, endure, survive when they can, break when they can't. The organisations spin the returns as exceptions, as evidence that some children are too damaged to be saved. But you've lived this system from the inside. You know that placement success depends almost entirely on luck, on which family selects you, on whether their motivations are primarily economic or genuinely familial, on whether they see you as a person or a tool, on 1,000 factors no child can control. You were lucky. Mr. Hadley was hard but fair. He worked you brutally, but he fed you adequately and never beat you and taught you skills that let you build an independent life. That's all you needed. That's all any of the children needed. Just basic decency, basic humanity. The acknowledgement that a child, even a poor child, even a street child, has value beyond their labour. But that's not what the system guaranteed. The system guaranteed placement, not protection, not love, not even basic safety, just placement. And if the placement failed, that was the child's fault, the child's deficiency, the child's fundamental brokenness that no amount of rural Christian morality could fix. The returned children are the system's accusation, the evidence that something was wrong from the beginning, that you can't solve urban poverty by shipping it elsewhere, that you can't save children by separating them from everything they know and giving them to strangers with minimal oversight. That good intentions don't excuse the harm done by poorly designed systems, but nobody wants to hear that. Not in the 1880s when the trains are still running strong, not in the 1890s when the system is celebrated as progressive reform, not even in the 1920s when it finally starts winding down. The truth about the orphan trains, the full, complicated, painful truth, won't be told for another century. When descendants start searching, when genealogists start finding gaps in family trees, when DNA tests start revealing surprises, when the 2 million people descended from orphan train riders begin asking questions their grandparents couldn't answer and their parents didn't know to ask. You won't live to see that reckoning. You're 35 in 1883. You have maybe another 30 years. You'll die before the train stops running, before the system is fully dismantled, before anyone acknowledges that what happened to you and James and the girl with the rag doll and the boy with scars and the 250,000 other children was both salvation and violation, both rescue and trauma, both the best available option and a profound failure of societal responsibility. But you've always known. From that first day on the platform in Dowagiac when you were 12 years old and being examined by strangers who would decide your fate in minutes, you knew that this system, for all its rhetoric about charity and opportunity, was fundamentally about convenience, about solving New York's problem by making it the Midwest's problem, about moving children like cargo and hoping most of them survived the journey. Some did survive, thrived even, built families and businesses and lives, became the success stories, the proof that the system worked, but others didn't. They broke, they disappeared, they died young or lived long with wounds that never healed. They became the inconvenient truth, the evidence that good intentions aren't enough, that systems designed without accountability inevitably harm the people they're supposed to help. And the trains kept running. For 75 years. 250,000 children. Until finally, in 1929, the last train departed New York. The last group of children was placed, and the era of the orphan trains officially ended. But the consequences didn't end. They're still unfolding, still being discovered, still shaping the lives of people who don't even know they're descended from riders. That's the real legacy of the orphan trains, not the children who were saved, but the families that were destroyed, the identities that were erased, the histories that were buried, and the millions of people today who are still trying to piece together stories that were deliberately made impossible to tell. By the 1880s, The Orphan Train Movement is no longer an experiment, it's an institution, an industry, a well-oiled machine processing children at a scale that would have been unimaginable when that first train left New York in 1854. The numbers are staggering. The Children's Aid Society alone is placing over 1,300 children annually. The New York Foundling Hospital is sending baby trains to Catholic communities across 20 states. Other organizations have joined the effort. The Boston Children's Mission, the Philadelphia Foundling Home. Even smaller cities are establishing their own placing out programs, modeling them after Brace's original system. The trains run weekly now, sometimes multiple trains per week during peak placement seasons. Spring and early summer, when farm families need extra hands for planting and harvest. The logistics are impressive, complex. Children are gathered from streets, orphanages, foundling homes. They're bathed, clothed, documented. Though those documents are often incomplete, deliberately vague, designed to allow children to shed their pasts entirely. Then they're loaded onto trains and sent to pre-selected towns where agents have arranged public gatherings. The selection process has become ritualized, standardized. Towns advertise the arrival of orphan trains in newspapers. Families arrive from miles around. The children are displayed, usually in churches or town halls now rather than train platforms. The spectacle has moved indoors, but it's no less dehumanizing. Children stand in rows while adults examine them, feel their muscles, check their teeth, ask them to read or recite Bible verses, or demonstrate that they're capable of basic obedience. You're 48 years old in 1891. You've been free of your indenture for 30 years. You own your farm now, paid off the debt. You even have a hired hand, a young man from town, not an orphan train rider. You pay him wages, give him Sundays off. Treat him the way you wish someone had treated you. You've married. Your wife is a widow who brought 2 children into the marriage. Together you've had 3 more. 5 children total. A full house. Noise and chaos and the kind of family you never imagined you'd have when you were 12 years old on that platform in Dowagiac. But you still pay attention to the trains, still watch when they arrive. And what you see in 1891 is different from what you experienced in 1854. The system is more efficient, more organized, but also more callous. The volume has made it impersonal. These children aren't individuals with stories and histories. They're units, inventory, problems being solved through geographic redistribution. You attend a placement event in the town hall, not to take a child, just to witness, to see if the system has improved or if it's just gotten better at hiding its flaws. 60 children are presented. They range from age 4 to 15. They've been on the train for 3 days. They're exhausted, disoriented, some are crying. Others have that blank dissociative stare you remember from your own journey. The look of someone whose mind has separated from their body as a survival mechanism. The agent running the event gives a speech, talks about Christian duty, about the opportunity to save a child's life, about the abundance of labour these children represent. He's explicit about that. These children will work. They're not pets or charity cases. They're investments, family labour forces, and the families taking them should expect a return on that investment. The selection begins. It's faster than you remember, more transactional. A farmer points at a boy. The agent asks the boy his name. The boy answers. The farmer nods. Papers are signed. The boy leaves with the farmer. Total interaction time, less than 3 minutes. That boy's entire future decided in the time it takes to boil water for tea. You watch a brother and sister get separated. They're holding hands when the event starts. A woman selects the girl. A different family selects the boy. The children realize what's happening. They start crying, begging to stay together. The agent tells them firmly that they're fortunate to both be chosen, that many siblings aren't so lucky, that they should be grateful. The girl is pulled away first. She's screaming, reaching for her brother. The woman taking her looks uncomfortable but determined. She's made her choice. She wants a girl, not a boy. She's not changing her mind because of tears. The boy goes silent, stops fighting, just watches his sister disappear through the door. His face does something you recognize. It shutters, closes. He's learning the same lesson you learned. That resistance is futile. that your feelings don't matter, that survival means accepting whatever happens and making the best of it. The event lasts 2 hours. By the end, 53 children have been placed. 7 remain. They're the ones nobody wants. Too old, too sickly. Too obviously damaged. The agent announces that these 7 will continue to the next town. They'll have another chance. If they're not placed after 3 attempts, they'll be returned to New York. You leave the town hall feeling sick. This isn't better than what you experienced. It's worse. The scale is made industrial, mechanical. The humanity has been processed out in favour of efficiency. And everyone acts like this is progress. Like the ability to place thousands of children annually is something to celebrate rather than examine. That night you tell your wife about what you witnessed. She's sympathetic but pragmatic. She grew up in Michigan, never experienced urban poverty. To her, the orphan trains are a reasonable solution to a distant problem. Those children would die in the city, she says. At least here they have a chance. You don't argue, but you think about the siblings, about the 7 rejected children, about the 250,000 children who have been processed through this system over 4 decades, about how many found real families versus how many found exploitation, about whether the chance they were given was worth the cost of everything they lost. And you realise that you'll never know the answer, that the system is too big, too diffuse, too deliberate about not tracking outcomes, that the success stories are celebrated and the failures are buried, that the true impact of the orphan trains won't be understood for generations, won't be fully reckoned with until long after everyone involved is dead. But the trains keep running, year after year, into the new century, into the 1900s and 1910s and 1920s. The largest child migration in American history, and nobody in power is asking whether it should continue, only how to make it more efficient. There were categories of children the system couldn't place easily, or at all, and what happened to them reveals everything the organisations didn't want to admit about the placement process. Children of colour, disabled children, children who were too old, children who looked too ethnic, children whose poverty was written too clearly in their bodies. These children rode the trains just like the others, but their outcomes were drastically different. The vast majority of orphan train riders were white, Irish, Italian, German, Polish, immigrant children whose ethnicity marked them as undesirable in the eyes of wealthy New York families, but who could pass for American once removed from urban ethnic enclaves. The system was designed for them. The receiving communities expected them. But there were children of colour in the city streets too. Black children, Chinese children, children of mixed race. They were poor, hungry, homeless, in just as much need of rescue as their white counterparts. Yet they were systematically excluded from most trains. The Children's Aid Society's records show minimal placement of black children. The few who were sent west faced additional barriers. Families willing to take white children often refused black children entirely. In some cases, black children who arrived on trains couldn't be placed at all. They were sent back immediately. The towns didn't want them, didn't see them as potential family members or even as valuable labour. They saw them as problems that should remain New York's problem. A few trains went to southern states specifically carrying black children. The placements there were rarely adoptions. They were labour contracts, arrangements barely distinguishable from the slavery that had ended just 20 years earlier. Children as young as 7 bound to families who would work them in fields, pay them nothing, and keep them until they were old enough to leave or desperate enough to run. The New York Foundling Hospital, despite its Catholic mission of universal charity, wasn't much better. Sister Irene's organisation placed primarily white Catholic children. The few attempts to place children of colour in Catholic communities met with resistance. Parishes that eagerly accepted white foundlings refused black or Chinese babies. The racial prejudice ran too deep. Even religious conviction couldn't overcome it. Disabled children faced similar barriers. A child with a limp or a withered arm or crossed eyes might ride the train but stood little chance of placement. Families wanted workers, strong bodies, health and vigour. A disability, even a minor one, made a child unmarketable. You witnessed this repeatedly over the decades. watched children with obvious disabilities stand on platforms while every other child was selected, watched them ride the circuit town after town after town, always rejected. Some were eventually placed with families who needed domestic servants rather than field labour. Some were institutionalised in asylums, some simply disappeared from the records. One girl you remember had a clubfoot. She was maybe 13, intelligent, well-spoken. She stood at 3 separate placement events. Nobody wanted her. She couldn't work a farm effectively, couldn't walk long distances, represented expense without return. The 4th time you saw her, she wasn't on the train anymore. You asked the agent what happened. He said she'd been sent back to New York, admitted to an asylum for incurables. She'd spend the rest of her life institutionalised because her foot turned inward, and that made her worthless in the calculus of the orphan train system. Older children, teenagers, also struggled with placement. Families wanted children young enough to be moulded, obedient, grateful. A 15-year-old had already developed a personality, opinions, resistance. They remembered too much about their previous lives, couldn't be as easily convinced that their new family was their real family. Boys over 14 were sometimes placed as straight labourers with no pretense of adoption. The contracts were explicit. Work until 21, receive room and board, then leave. No inheritance, no family connection. Just years of labour in exchange for basic survival. Girls over 14 faced different dangers. Some families took teenage girls specifically for domestic service. Cooking, cleaning, childcare, work that kept them inside and isolated. In the best cases, these girls were treated as employees. In the worst cases, they were treated as property, vulnerable to exploitation of every kind. With no family to protect them and no oversight from the placing agencies, these girls had no recourse when mistreated. They could run away, but where would they go? They could complain to local authorities, but who would believe a homeless city girl over a respectable farming family? The system created a hierarchy of desirability. At the top, white boys aged 7 to 12, strong, trainable, young enough to adapt but old enough to work. These boys were snatched up at first presentation. Multiple families competed for them. Next, white girls aged 6 to 10, valuable for domestic help and eventual household management. Easier to control than boys, less likely to run away. Further down, white teenagers who were harder to place but still had labour value. At the bottom, children of colour, disabled children, and children whose trauma was too visible to hide. These children might ride trains for months, presented dozens of times, rejected repeatedly, until they aged out of the system or the organisations gave up and institutionalised them. This hierarchy was never officially acknowledged. The organisations maintained that all children had equal chances, that every child deserved a family. But the placement statistics told a different story. Some children were wanted, others were tolerated, and some were never wanted at all. The system revealed what American society in the late 19th century believed about children and their value, that some lives mattered more than others, that usefulness determined worthiness, that children who couldn't work or wouldn't assimilate or couldn't pass as respectable Americans were expendable. These beliefs weren't unique to the orphan trains. They permeated every aspect of American life. Child labour laws didn't exist. Children worked in factories and mines and on farms with no protection. Compulsory education wasn't universal. Poverty was considered a moral failing rather than a systemic issue. The orphan trains simply made these beliefs visible, undeniable. Children lined up and selected based on productivity potential. The ones who couldn't perform discarded. The system was American capitalism applied to child welfare, and it worked exactly as capitalism always works. Efficiently for some, devastatingly for others, and with profound indifference to those it deemed unworthy of investment. The first serious criticism of the orphan train system didn't come until the early 1900s, 50 years after the first train. After 200,000 children had already been processed through the system, after generations had been shaped by it. The criticism came from an unexpected source: social workers, a new profession emerging from progressive-era reform movements. These were educated women, mostly, who believed that poverty was a structural problem requiring scientific solutions. They studied families, documented conditions, applied methodology to what had previously been handled through charity and moral judgment. And when social workers examined the orphan train system, they found it profoundly troubling. In 1904, a social worker named Hastings Hart published a report examining child placing practices across the United States. His findings were damning. He documented placements where children were treated as servants, where oversight was non-existent, where siblings were needlessly separated, where children's identities were erased without justification, where no one tracked outcomes or followed up to ensure children's safety. Hart wasn't opposed to placing out in principle. He acknowledged that some institutions were worse than foster care, but he argued that the system needed regulation, legal protections for children, background checks for families, regular inspections, the ability for children to be removed from abusive situations. The Children's Aid Society responded defensively. They pointed to their success stories, the children who'd become farmers and teachers and productive citizens. They argue that regulation would slow the process, make it expensive, reduce the number of children they could help. That some risk was acceptable given the alternative, children dying on city streets. But Hart's report sparked a conversation. Other social workers began investigating, documenting failures. In 1909, a follow-up study found that 30% of placements involved significant exploitation or abuse. 30%. Nearly 1 in 3 children placed through the system experienced conditions that investigators classified as harmful. The organizations disputed these numbers, said the investigators were biased, that they focused on failures and ignored successes, that most children were doing fine, and the critics were manufacturing a crisis to justify their own existence as a profession. There was truth on both sides. Many children were doing fine, but many weren't. And the system had no mechanism for distinguishing between the two, had no way to protect the children who needed protection, because protection required oversight, and oversight was expensive and inconvenient. You're 62 years old in 1907 when you first read about these investigations in the newspaper. You're sitting in your kitchen. Your children are grown. Your wife is preparing supper. And you're reading about something you experienced 53 years ago being debated by people who've never stood on a platform waiting to be chosen. Part of you feels vindicated, validated. You always knew the system was flawed. Always knew that your positive outcome was luck, not design. That thousands of children weren't as fortunate, that the celebratory rhetoric around the orphan trains obscured real harm. But part of you feels defensive too, because you are a success story. You built a life, raised a family, own land. You're exactly what Charles Loring Brace said could happen if street children were given opportunities. And the critics seem to suggest that people like you don't matter, that the successes don't count because the system also created failures. The truth is more complicated. The system did save some children, did give them opportunities they wouldn't have had otherwise, but it also traumatized and exploited and destroyed others, and the fact that some survived doesn't excuse the harm done to those who didn't. The debate intensifies through the 1910s. State governments begin passing laws regulating child placement, requiring home studies, mandating follow-up visits. Some states ban interstate placement entirely, arguing that their own children should take priority over imports from other states. The orphan trains begin to slow, not because the need disappears, there are still homeless children in New York and other cities, but because the political and legal environment has changed, because child labour laws are making children less economically valuable, because compulsory education means children can't work full-time anymore, because families who might have taken an orphan train child for labour no longer have the same incentives. The Children's Aid Society adapts, starts doing more preliminary work, matching children and families before transport, requiring references, conducting inspections. Not because Charles Loring Brace's successors believe it's necessary, but because the law now requires it. The New York Foundling Hospital, which always maintained tighter control, faces less pressure. but they too make changes. More documentation, more follow-up, more attention to outcomes rather than just placements. By 1920, the golden age is over. The trains still run, but sporadically, a few dozen children per year instead of hundreds. The system is dying. Not with a bang, but a slow, gradual obsolescence. In 1929, the last official orphan train departs New York. The passengers are mostly teenagers. The receiving community is in Kansas. The placement process is highly regulated. Home studies, background checks, legal adoption papers. It barely resembles the system that started 75 years earlier. You're 84 years old when the last train runs. You've outlived your wife, outlived 3 of your children. You're living with your oldest daughter now. Her children, your grandchildren, are teenagers themselves. One of them asks you about the orphan trains because she's heard stories, knows you came west on one, wants to know what it was like. You don't know how to answer. How do you summarize 70 years of life that started with being chosen by a stranger on a platform? How do you explain that the system both saved you and wounded you? That you're grateful to be alive but angry about how you had to survive? You tell her the simple version, that you were poor in New York, that a charitable organization sent you west, that you worked on a farm and eventually bought your own land, that America gives people opportunities if they're willing to work hard. It's true, but it's not the whole truth. It doesn't include the trauma, the fear. The children who didn't make it, the ones who were returned or ran away or died young, the siblings who were separated and never found each other again, the identities that were erased, the families that were destroyed. Your granddaughter seems satisfied with the simple version. She's young. She wants to believe in redemption narratives, in happy endings. You don't have the heart to complicate that for her. But late that night, alone in your room, you think about all the children who rode those trains. The 250,000 lives disrupted. The 2 million descendants who'll spend the next century trying to piece together family histories that were deliberately obscured. You think about James, the 8-year-old you taught to collect eggs. You lost track of him decades ago. Don't know if he's alive or dead. Don't know if he married or had children or if anyone remembers his story. You think about the girl with the rag doll, the boy with scars, the siblings separated in the town hall, the disabled girl sent to an asylum, the children of colour who were never given a real chance. All the lives touched by a system that meant well and did harm in equal measure. And you realise that the end of the orphan trains doesn't mean the end of their impact. That legacy will continue. Through families, through descendants, through the ways American society thinks about child welfare and poverty, and who deserves rescue and on what terms. The trains have stopped running. But the consequences will roll forward for generations. The trains are slowing down. It's 1922. You're 79 years old. You've watched this system operate for 68 years, watched it grow from an experiment with 40-some children to an industry processing thousands annually. And now you're watching it die. Not dramatically. Not with protests or scandal or sudden collapse. Just a slow fade as the world that made the orphan trains necessary stops existing. The first blow comes from child labour laws. States are passing legislation limiting how many hours children can work, requiring school attendance, making it illegal to employ children under certain ages in certain industries. Suddenly, the economic calculation that made orphan train children attractive shifts. Farming families who wanted free labour discover that the labour isn't as free as it used to be, that they're required to send children to school, to limit work hours, to treat children more like dependents than employees. The second blow comes from mothers' pensions. Progressive reformers have convinced several states to provide financial assistance to widows and single mothers. The logic is simple. If poverty is the reason mothers surrender children, then eliminating poverty eliminates the need for surrender. Give mothers enough money to feed their children, and they won't have to give them away. It's a radical concept. The idea that society owes poor family support rather than judgment. That keeping families together might be better than separating them. That children belong with their mothers unless those mothers are genuinely unfit, not just poor. The Children's Aid Society and the Foundling Hospital resist these changes, argue that mothers' pensions will encourage dependency. That removing children from bad environments is still necessary regardless of financial support. that their systems have worked for 70 years and shouldn't be dismantled based on new theories. But the cultural momentum has shifted. Social workers, those professional reformers who started criticising the system 20 years ago, have gained influence. They're staffing new state welfare departments, writing regulations, conducting studies that document what you've known all along, that placing children without oversight creates opportunities for exploitation, that good intentions don't guarantee good outcomes, that the orphan train system saved some children but harmed others, and nobody bothered tracking which was which. In 1924, you read an article in a farming magazine about the changing nature of agriculture. Mechanization is reducing the need for manual labor. Tractors are replacing horses and the young men who managed them. Threshers and combines are making harvest faster and less labor-intensive. The article doesn't mention Orphan Trains specifically, but you understand the implication. The economic foundation that supported the system is crumbling. Children aren't as valuable as they used to be. You think about James, your 8-year-old shadow from decades ago. He's in his 50s now, has his own farm, never took an orphan train child himself. When you asked him why, years ago, he just shook his head, said he couldn't do that to a child, couldn't recreate the system that processed him. You understood. Some experiences you don't perpetuate. The trains keep running through the 20s, but they're shadows of what they were. Dozens of children per year instead of hundreds. More regulation means more paperwork, more screening, more follow-up. The organisations complain that the process has become expensive and cumbersome, that they're helping fewer children because of bureaucratic red tape. But the social workers counter that helping fewer children well is better than helping more children badly. That quantity was never the right metric, that the true measure of success isn't how many children you place, but how many thrive after placement. It's an argument the orphan train organisations can't win, because they don't have the data, never tracked outcomes systematically, can't prove that their methods produce better results than the new, more regulated approaches. They have anecdotes, success stories like yours. But they also have the failures that investigators documented. The 30% exploitation rate, the returned children, the siblings separated unnecessarily, the identities erased without justification. In 1929, the stock market crashes. The Great Depression begins, and suddenly everyone is poor. The urban-rural divide that made the orphan trains possible dissolves. Farming families can barely feed themselves. Nobody's looking to take additional mouths to feed. The demand for children evaporates. That same year, the last official orphan train runs. You read about it in the newspaper. A small group of children sent to Texas. The article is brief, treats it as routine, doesn't mention that this is the end of a 75-year experiment, that this is the last time children will be loaded onto trains and distributed to strangers based on a system that prioritized efficiency over safety. You're 86 years old. You've outlived the movement that shaped your life. You should feel something about that. Relief, maybe, or vindication. But mostly you feel tired and aware that the end of the trains doesn't mean the end of the story. That consequences don't stop just because the system that created them has shut down. Your grandchildren are adults now. Your great-grandchildren are being born. They'll grow up never knowing that orphan trains existed, never understanding that their family tree includes a boy who was chosen on a platform in Michigan when he was 12 years old, never grappling with the reality that their lineage includes trauma and displacement and survival, against odds they'll never fully comprehend. You think about telling them, recording your story somehow, making sure someone knows what happened. But every time you try, the words stick in your throat. How do you explain that you were saved and harmed simultaneously? That you're grateful to be alive but angry about the cost of survival? That the system that processed you was both mercy and violation? So you stay silent. Like most orphan train riders, you let the story die with you. Let your descendants discover the truth through genealogy, researched decades later when you're long dead and can't answer their questions. The trains have stopped, but the silence is just beginning. For 50 years after the last train runs, the orphan train movement is largely forgotten. not deliberately suppressed, just crowded out by other crises: the Depression, World War II, the Cold War, Korea, Vietnam. America has bigger concerns than a defunct child welfare program from the previous century. The children who rode the trains grow old. Most of them don't talk about their experiences, some because the memories are painful, some because they've built new identities and don't want to resurrect the past, some because they've been explicitly told by their adoptive families that their origins are shameful, that being an orphan train rider is something to hide, not share. You die in 1937. You're 94 years old. You've lived longer than most people from your generation, survived the brutal childhood that killed so many of your peers, built a life that spanned nearly a century of American transformation. Your obituary mentions that you were a farmer, a landowner, a family man. It doesn't mention the orphan train, doesn't mention Dowagiac or New York or the platform where you were chosen. Your children know bits and pieces of your story, but not the full narrative. And they don't ask for details. They're focused on the Depression, on survival, on their own children's futures. Your story becomes family legend, simplified, sanitized. Grandpa came from New York as a child, worked hard, built this farm. The complexity disappears. The trauma is edited out. You become a bootstraps narrative, proof that anyone can succeed in America if they're willing to work. But in the 1970s, something shifts. The first generation of orphan train riders has mostly died. Their children are in their 50s and 60s. Their grandchildren are adults. And some of those grandchildren start asking questions, start poking at family trees that have strange gaps and inconsistencies, start wondering why they can't trace their lineage past a certain point, why birth certificates are missing or suspicious, why DNA tests reveal unexpected ethnic backgrounds. The genealogy movement is beginning. Amateur researchers are learning how to navigate archives and courthouse records. They're discovering that their grandparents' stories don't add up, that the nice narrative about coming from New York to work on a farm was actually part of a massive organized system that processed 250,000 children. In 1978, a historian publishes one of the first academic studies of the orphan trains. The book is dry, academic, but it reaches people who've been searching for answers, people who suspected their family histories included orphan trains but couldn't confirm it. The book provides context, validation, proof that their suspicions were correct. Orphan train riders' reunions begin. Small gatherings at first, a dozen elderly people, most in their 80s and 90s, sharing stories they've kept silent for 70 years. The reunions are emotional, cathartic. These are people who've spent their entire lives believing their experiences were unique, individual, and now they're discovering that they were part of something massive, systematic, that their trauma was replicated across thousands of other lives. One woman, placed in 1889, speaks at a reunion in 1982. She's 97 years old. She talks about being separated from her 3 siblings on a platform in Nebraska, about watching her baby sister be chosen by a family heading south while she was taken north, about never seeing that sister again, about spending 90 years wondering if her sister survived, if she had a good life, if she ever thought about the siblings she lost. The audience is silent. Everyone in the room has a similar story. Siblings lost, identities erased, questions that will never be answered. And they're realizing collectively that this wasn't just personal tragedy. It was structural, designed into the system. The separations weren't accidents. They were policy, convenient, efficient. Nobody thought about consequences because the children's feelings weren't considered relevant to the calculus. By the 1980s and 90s, the search intensifies. Genealogical societies dedicated to orphan train research form. They're compiling databases, matching names to records, helping descendants trace family trees that were deliberately obscured. The work is painstaking. Many records were destroyed, names were changed, birth certificates were falsified, but piece by piece the researchers are reconstructing the hidden history. In 2009, a comprehensive book about the orphan trains is published. It reaches a general audience. People who aren't descendants but are simply interested in this forgotten chapter of American history. The book becomes a touchstone, a reference point. It's not perfect. Historians will debate its interpretations for years, but it makes the movement visible again. Undeniable. In 2013, a novel about an orphan train rider becomes a massive bestseller. Suddenly millions of people are reading about the movement. The fiction brings emotional resonance that academic histories couldn't provide. Readers connect with the characters, start asking if the events in the book really happened, start researching, start discovering that yes, this was real. This happened to real children, and some of those children's descendants are alive today. The modern descendants number around 2 million people. Most of them don't know they're descended from orphan train riders. The information was lost, buried, deliberately hidden by grandparents and great-grandparents who were ashamed or traumatized or simply wanted to move forward without looking back. But DNA testing is changing that. Ancestry websites are revealing connections that shouldn't exist based on official family narratives. A woman in California discovers through DNA that she has relatives in Iowa she never knew about. The investigation reveals that her grandmother was an orphan train rider, that the siblings were separated, that whole branches of her family tree were hidden from her. These discoveries are happening thousands of times. DNA is exposing the orphan train's legacy in ways that documents never could. It's forcing families to confront histories they didn't know existed, to grapple with the reality that their identities are built on foundations that were deliberately obscured. The orphan train riders themselves are gone now. The last known rider died in the early 2000s, but their descendants remain. 2 million people carrying intergenerational trauma they don't fully understand. Gaps in family knowledge that create identity confusion. A sense that something in their family history doesn't quite add up, and they're searching, using every tool available, archives, DNA, social media groups dedicated to orphan train research. They're finding each other, discovering their cousins who never knew they were related, reconstructing family trees that were deliberately pruned 70, 80, 100 years ago. The silence is breaking. The story is being told, not by the organizations that ran the trains. They've moved on, rebranded, focused on contemporary child welfare work, but by the descendants, by people who need to know where they came from, who refuse to accept that their family histories should remain mysteries. This is the true legacy of the orphan trains, not the placements, not the success stories or the failures, but the ongoing search, the millions of people trying to answer the most basic questions. Who am I? Where did I come from? What happened to my family? The orphan trains created modern American child welfare. That's not hyperbole. The foster care system, the adoption industry, the concept of out-of-home placement, all of these trace directly back to Charles Loring Brace's experiment. The problems we see in contemporary child welfare aren't new. They're the same problems that plagued the orphan trains. We've just renamed them, repackaged them, pretended they're different. Children are still removed from families primarily because of poverty. We call it neglect now. We use professional language in court proceedings. But the fundamental dynamic is the same. Poor families lose their children because they're poor, and we've decided that's a child welfare issue rather than an economic justice issue. Children are still placed with strangers with insufficient screening. We have home studies now, background checks, more regulation than existed in 1854, but children still end up in abusive placements, still experience exploitation, still fall through gaps in oversight because the system prioritizes placement speed over child safety. Siblings are still separated, not always, not as systematically as the orphan train separated them, but it happens. Foster care agencies claim they try to keep siblings together, but when you need placements immediately and you have limited options, siblings get divided. And just like the orphan train children, modern foster children spend years wondering about brothers and sisters they were torn from, carrying the wound of that separation their whole lives. The orphan trains should have taught us something, should have provided clear lessons about what works and what causes harm in child welfare, but we didn't learn. We repeated the same mistakes with different vocabulary. Why? Because the fundamental problem hasn't changed. Child welfare is expensive. Keeping families together requires addressing poverty, addiction, mental illness, domestic violence, all of which require sustained investment. Removing children is cheaper, faster. It looks like action. It lets us believe we're protecting children even when we're just moving them from one difficult situation to another. The 2 million descendants of orphan train riders understand this intuitively. Many of them work in child welfare, social work, foster care advocacy. They see the parallels, recognize that their ancestors' experiences are being replicated in contemporary systems, and they're trying to change it, advocating for family preservation, for better oversight, for actually tracking outcomes instead of just measuring placements. But change is slow. The infrastructure built by the orphan trains, the belief that moving children solves problems, that poor families can't be trusted to raise their own children, that oversight is expensive and therefore optional, this infrastructure is deeply embedded. It's shaped American attitudes about childhood and poverty for over a century. The orphan trains also created something unexpected. They proved that children are resilient, that humans can survive enormous trauma and still build lives, still find joy, still create families. Your story proves that. You were 12 years old, chosen by a stranger, worked like an adult, denied your childhood, and you survived. Built a farm, raised children, lived 94 years. But survival isn't the same as thriving, and resilience shouldn't be necessary. The fact that children can endure trauma doesn't mean they should have to. The orphan train success stories, and you were one, don't excuse the system that created the trauma in the first place. That's the tension at the heart of the orphan train legacy. How do you honour the survivors without glorifying the system? How do you acknowledge that some children's lives were genuinely improved while also confronting that the improvements came at enormous cost? How do you tell a story that's simultaneously rescue and violation? The descendants are figuring this out. They're telling complex stories, rejecting simplistic narratives that paint the orphan trains as either pure heroism or pure villainy. They're embracing the contradiction. My grandmother was saved by the orphan trains, and she was harmed by them. Both things are true. Both deserve recognition. This nuanced storytelling is important, because child welfare still needs that nuance. Contemporary foster care isn't all bad. Some children genuinely need to be removed from dangerous situations. Some foster families provide genuine love and stability, but the system also causes tremendous harm. Separates children unnecessarily, traumatizes families, prioritizes efficiency over humanity. We need to hold both truths simultaneously. The orphan trains teach us how. They also teach us about the importance of preservation, of records, of memory. The reason 2 million descendants are searching today is because information was destroyed or hidden. Birth certificates were falsified, names were changed, families were told to forget, and that forgetting caused intergenerational pain. Descendants who don't know their medical histories, who can't answer their children's questions about ethnic heritage, who feel fundamentally disconnected from their own origins. Modern child welfare is making some of the same mistakes. Sealed adoption records, confidential foster care files, birth parents whose names are redacted from documents. We're still prioritizing the comfort of institutions and adoptive families over the rights of people to know their own histories. The orphan train descendants are fighting this, advocating for open records, for DNA testing access, for the principle that people have a right to their own stories. It's an uphill battle, but it's necessary, because the alternative is another century of people searching for answers that should never have been hidden. If there's a lesson in the orphan trains, it's this: good intentions aren't enough. Charles Loring Brace genuinely believed he was saving children. Sister Mary Irene Fitzgibbon genuinely believed her methods were more humane. The families who took orphan train children mostly believed they were doing good. But belief doesn't guarantee outcome. Systems need accountability, oversight. The humility to recognize when they're causing harm and the courage to change. We're still learning that lesson, still building child welfare systems that prioritize convenience over children, still separating families because it's easier than supporting them, still measuring success by placement numbers instead of child well-being. The orphan trains ran for 75 years, processed 250,000 children, created 2 million descendants who are still grappling with the consequences. The trains have been gone for nearly a century. But the legacy is still unfolding, still shaping lives, still demanding that we reckon with what was done in the name of charity and what we owe to the children, past and present, who survived our best intentions. But here's what most people don't know about where it all began. That first train in 1854 wasn't the organised, carefully planned system the Children's Aid Society later claimed. It was chaos. 40-some children gathered hastily. An agent who made placement decisions on a steamboat before the train even left New York. A town that had barely been notified they were receiving homeless children. And a selection process so rushed that every single child was placed in a single afternoon. No follow-up, no oversight, no second chances. The story of that first train to Dowagiac, Michigan is darker and stranger than anything that came after. And next time, we're going back to where it started. To the moment when Charles Loring Brace's theory became reality, and 40-some children learned what it meant to be treated like livestock at auction. You won't believe what happened on that platform, or who was making decisions, or how little anyone cared about what the children wanted. Because the first train set the pattern for everything that followed, and understanding what went wrong from the very beginning explains why the system never fixed itself, why 75 years of orphan trains kept repeating the same mistakes, why 2 million descendants are still searching for answers. That story's next, and it's not what you think.